Hi, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of the At Peace Parents podcast and YouTube channel. Today, I have invited one of my favorite people and dear friend and coach with At Peace Parents, Kendahl Damashek, who will be talking about her unique experience as a mom raising four PDA autistic children under the age of 10, as well as her lived experience as a PDA adult and some of the insights she has from working as a coach with parents of PDA children and teens. So, Kendahl has an educational background in psychology and neuroscience and a BA from Amherst College. She was the lead research assistant on a project studying therapeutic alliance at UMass Amherst and worked with middle school children in San Francisco before focusing her energy and creativity on parenting and caregiving. Kendahl brings her warmth, passion, and logical brain to her area of expertise, which is supporting parents and families with a larger or more complex family dynamic. Welcome, Kendahl. How are
Hey,
you?
I'm good. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so excited to do this.
Me too.
Um, is there anything you'd like to add to your bio, or should we just jump right in?
We can just jump right in. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Um, Kendahl, can you tell us a little bit more about your journey to learning about pathological demand avoidance or pervasive drive for autonomy?
Yeah. So the person who kind of started me on this journey was my son, Jamie. I knew from when he was very young that something was different. Now I can identify that his nervous system functioned differently, but back then I didn't know. But I remember even asking pediatricians like as early as when he was like 9 months old, and filling out autism checklists and being like, do these apply? Some of these apply, but he makes eye contact. And so I was kind of always written off like, no, he's social, he's not autistic, it's fine. Um, but we started noticing lots of like what a therapist identified as like sensory processing differences, and so that was kind of like the first route that we went down, was like the sensory processing disorder route. And but I remember like calling in, my husband's a professor, and where he was working at the time there was a an occupational therapy program, and I called in um the one of the professors there who actually specializes in like pediatric sensory OT.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like super helpful and came to do like just kind of like an observation of Jamie. And even she was like, yeah, he definitely has sensory processing differences, but like they are really fluctuating. They are really hybrid. Like she was confused by the presentation also.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I kept seeing things that were more and more, seemed more and more autistic to me, especially like as he got a little older and he was in pre-K, and just there were social differences, even though he still is like a very social human. He loves other people. He loves making other people laugh, cracking jokes, all of that. But just the engagement was different. And, we went to developmental pediatrician, got a diagnosis of anxiety and sensory differences with like a specific note that was like, cannot be autistic because he makes eye contact and made jokes during the session
Yeah, yeah.
during the evaluation. Um, and then we got like a neuropsych evaluation the following year that confirmed a diagnosis of autism. But still, then I was like, going down the laminated visual aid road that the all the autism stuff leads down, and trying more behavioral strategies, which I didn't start out with, and those started to make things worse, and it just wasn't fitting. There was something that wasn't fitting. And so I started researching like atypical presentations of autism, through Instagram mostly, and the internet, but mostly Instagram, and looking at female presentations of autism, et cetera. And then so like I think through those searches my algorithm brought me PDA. And
Yeah.
that's how we first learned about it.
Yeah. And for you, when you started learning about PDA, was it an immediate aha moment, or was it sort of like over time it worked its way into fitting?
Yeah, I think it was both because when I first saw descriptions of PDA, there was like, I think a lot of the examples were older kids. A lot of the examples were like extreme versions of fight behavior. And like, Jamie has a fight response. And like, we would see that at home. Like, there would be what felt like feral animal responses
Yeah.
to, you know, any time I tried to correct or redirect or anything. Um, or just sometimes seemingly randomly. And so like I knew there was that fight behavior, but it wasn't like it didn't totally match the like very violent descriptions of PDA that were first coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when it really clicked for me was when I started reading about equalizing.
Mm-hmm.
That for me was like all of a sudden, like everything was in focus. And I think part of the reason for that is because I was a pretty naturally accommodating parent. I came from like the gentle parenting sphere of things. Like, I remember even with my firstborn, like while being pregnant with him, like listening to audiobooks of Janet Lansbury, before he was even born, right? So
Yeah.
like I wasn't doing 1, 2, 3 magic. I wasn't doing timeouts. I wasn't doing all of these like behavioral strategies like throughout their childhood. I'd always like prioritize their autonomy because that's like a very big part of that, like specifically like rye parenting, which was what I used most. But like because of that, I don't think we were in full burnout when I started to hear about PDA. We
Mm-hmm.
got there. Um, but so it makes sense that like if what was being described were kids in burnout,
Yeah.
and what I had was kids who were approaching but not in burnout, then the descriptions weren't totally matching. So when I found equalizing, then it was like, oh, this is what's happening in my home. And not only for Jamie, but also for my oldest son, Stefan. That was like very obvious right when I found out about that because he was more of like an ADHD presentation and he was like flight, right? Everything
Yeah.
was movement, everything was climbing on top of a car. It was like hiding, whenever we asked him to do something um and equalizing verbally, which I hadn't really seen presented in social media with the like burnout examples that we were getting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for a parent who might be watching this and be new to PDA or be
Yeah.
listening, like how would you explain equalizing behavior?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is a child's or any PDA human. It's the attempt to get back to a sense of felt safety. So it's like your body is sensing or subconsciously neurocepting, but like sensing that there's threat and it's giving itself an accommodation.
Hmm.
So it's giving itself an equality accommodation or it's giving itself an autonomy accommodation. And we're not at full fight flight presentation yet, even though those like inform, I think, the type of equalizing that a kid does. Um, but I think about it like you can sense that there's danger. So how do I feel safe? And even though it's not logical, this is like what the body is doing. So
Yeah.
then, like, okay, if I can autonomously do something that I shouldn't be doing, then I'm giving myself an autonomy accommodation and I'm starting to feel better, right? I'm not going to reach that dangerous tipping point.
Yeah. Yeah. An example, like some of the clearer examples that I just did not understand as a mom would be like where I would be like, could you please pick up your shoes? And my son would comply, but then he'd either go
Yeah.
directly over to his younger sibling and destroy his things, or he
Yes.
would take something that I cared about, like a book I was reading, and throw it on the floor or like dump the spices out. Right. And
Yes.
it was just like, okay, he complied with putting his shoes on. So
Right.
what's going on with the spices, right? But
Yes.
when we understand it like you explained it, it's like getting back to that place of safety and sometimes overshooting the equality and trying to be above
Yes.
the parent or a sibling, for example. Um,
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you. So, would you mind giving some? So, you talked about how, like, when you were first learning about PDA, a lot of the examples, and I found this too, were kind of extreme,
Yeah.
right? Like, even in the support group. So, it's like there was a bias towards people who were in crisis and in
Yes.
desperate times, and that makes sense. But it was like, I've had to institutionalize my child because they're, threatening me, or even the first book I read, Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome, it was very much about like the cases they followed were pretty depressing because it was like these teenagers who had trouble with the law and it was very extreme. And
Yeah.
so you mentioned like a lot of that didn't feel in the moment like it was clicking, and it didn't for me either. It just scared
Right.
me.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. And it actually made me want to like step back from the PDA label because I didn't want that to be my kid's future, right?
Yeah, because and like I want to give credit to the authors of that book because they explained
Yeah.
it. They were the first authors to write about it, and I think it's
Yeah.
like a big step forward in our understanding.
Totally.
It was just this snapshot, as you said, of like the most extreme cases or unsupported or in burnout
Yeah.
situations.
Yeah.
Um, so, you mentioned that like it didn't exactly fit with autism. It didn't even exactly fit with ODD, which might be those
Mhm.
more extreme defiant behaviors, and it didn't at first even clearly fit with PDA. But
Yeah.
do you have any examples of like how that was playing out for you, that not fitting and what you were seeing as the differences?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think was also key, what like in addition to the equalizing behaviors, was the high masking component.
Mm,
Um, so when I first found out about PDA, let's see, Jamie was like almost turning 6. He was 5, almost turning 6. So that means that Stefan was, so he's my oldest, he was like 7 or almost turning 7. They're a year apart. And then my younger ones were still pretty young. Um, so they must have been like 3 and 2.
mm,
So really I was like, now I see that there were even PDA behaviors there too, but they were still like in their toddler ages, and I was expecting some defiance at that age
yeah,
anyway, right?
yeah,
Um, so but really looking at my older two, I could really see the high massing component. Like, Jamie was in kindergarten and Stefan was he was in first grade, and like Stefan was teacher's pet. He was the helper in the classroom. He was like the model student.
yeah,
He did everything the way that he was supposed to do it. He followed every direction. He helped other students. He taught other students. He was so responsible and he was super popular. Like I remember going to, I guess it was like open house, um, and like walking up the hallway and him just having like a stream of high fives as we're
yeah,
walking up the hallway. Like people from his grade, people from 3 grades above him, just everybody shouting his name and like, um, so that didn't match that when he came home, then there were like screaming meltdowns and he was equalizing against Jamie to the point that would push Jamie into a fight response. It like I used to call it like the chain of equalizing. Like you'd
yeah,
have a kid, both the kids would come home dysregulated, but he in particular, I think because he masked so hard at school, would come home and just devolve. And at first I was like, is this after school restraint collapse? Like,
yeah,
and I talk with other parents, but it was like a matter of degree, right? Like other
yeah,
parents were like, yeah, my kid gets upset when they get home too. for 10 minutes or for 30 minutes, right? Like not like the entire afternoon through bedtime. And, it was just
Yeah.
like extreme.
And
Um,
also the qualitative nature of like crying versus like physical attacks of the
yes,
sibling or like screaming and
yes,
pain and growling and it's hard
yes,
to describe that as a parent because you're sort of like talking about apples and oranges but with the same
yeah,
name for it because you don't
right,
know.
right. You have this shared vocabulary and you mean two completely different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I I have this experience personally too, like, so I'm narcoleptic and I find that very similar to like the challenges that I had getting diagnosed with narcolepsy because everybody's tired. Everybody
Yeah.
like falls asleep in class once in a while. Everybody has had a time when they've like had sleep paralysis. Like these are common experiences, but the degree to which they're shared are like very different, right?
Yeah, the
Um,
degree, the frequency, the intensity, the duration.
yeah,
Because ultimately, like, even with the nervous system responses, like, all humans have the capacity, if
yes,
they are threatened, to scream and bite and kick and growl, and will do that if they sense that they're in danger of dying, which is what's
right,
happening to our kids.
right,
Like, their
exactly,
subconscious is like, hey, you're not going to survive this.
right, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think like, yeah, it's that degree of intensity, which I think is hard as a parent too, because even if you don't have a kid with PDA, like, I think parents are constantly being gaslit by well-meaning providers, well-meaning educators who probably have seen what they consider to be a lot worse than what you're talking about. And we, we're perceived as dramatic, right? It's our
Yeah.
kids, so we care more about their well-being and we're going to take it more seriously, even if in the grand scheme of things, it's not quote unquote so bad. But the same thing happens with PDA in particular, where yeah, like there is this kind of continuum of something that everybody experiences, but like we're at this other end of the scale, this other end of the bell curve, right? For how this response manifests and why it manifests. And so it's really hard to get people to take you seriously because they know these things happen, but like they don't understand the scale that you're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, So let me jump ahead to like you've got the PDA knowledge, you sort of have a grasp of what's going on, especially
Yeah.
your two oldest, Stefan and Jamie.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you to make practical and like real-time shifts in your parenting? Um, you mentioned that you had a gentle parenting, more attachment oriented
Yeah.
bent leading up to
Yeah.
all of this. So was it a hard shift or was it sort of a natural next step?
I think it was a mix. So, in some regards, it was a natural next step. Like, I'd never been that authoritarian figure. I really, one of the things like Rye parenting, which is like Janet Lansbury, Magda Gerber, that was like my home base for parenting. And there are some things that they have in common with PDA accommodations, like
Hmm.
you prioritize the autonomy of the child. Like you're not directing the child to play in certain ways. You're not like, you really are being respectful of the child's needs. And like, there's a lot of teaching to observe your child even from infancy and just like sit in a room with them and just be with them. So co-regulating with them, right?
Yeah.
But letting them explore. And if they invite you in, great. And if they don't invite you in, great. You're just there with them. And so, like, those skills, I think, prepared me in a lot of ways to like allow things to be child led,
Mm-hmm.
allow things to allow me to be there as a co regulator without having to like quote unquote do anything. Um, and then there's also the concept of like caregiving as connection. And that, so it's like in Rye parenting, you are treating every diaper change as like a moment for connection. And the idea is like in all of these caregiving interactions, like those are repeated so many times throughout the child's life when you're feeding, when you're, helping with toileting, that those can be these really loving, co-regulating interactions that are like moments for attachment with your child.
Hmm.
So like those concepts, I think, translate really well into PDA accommodations. But there were also things like, I think more societally, it was hard for me, like letting go of expectations of what is right and wrong to do as a parent, like, or to like let your kid do, like
Hmm.
that concept of like letting your child. Because like even in Rye parenting and in most any gentle parenting, like you're allowing for an emotional response to a boundary you set, right? But you're setting a lot more boundaries with
Yeah.
gentle parenting and like without having to take into consideration a child's root cause of dysregulation being, threat to autonomy and threat to equality.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So that was one
Yeah.
thing that was hard.
Um, that's so interesting. I'm just thinking as you're describing it, because I actually don't know that much about gentle parenting in that sense.
Yeah.
That wasn't something that interested me or I was directed towards or even used. I
Yeah.
could have used it probably.
Yeah.
Um, but I think with the caregiving as connection, that's a key feature of finding meaning in what we're doing with children with a nervous system disability. However, the hurdle we have to get over is the notion that like the caregiving stops after they're 3 and potty trained, right?
Exactly.
And so it's like when I'm lowering demands for my son, it means I'm doing things for him, like feeding. Like there were times when I was actually feeding him with a
Yeah.
spoon, or I still bring him food at 9.5, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but I view it as caregiving for the nervous system disability, and that is a big part of our connection. It has
Yeah.
diminished over time, but not what you would expect looking through a neurotypical lens of like, why do you have to go get your child their clothes or help them put their
Right.
shoes on when they're almost 10,
Right.
right?
Yeah. There really is like an extension of the type of caregiving that you provide when you have an infant or a young toddler
Mm-hmm.
that extends when you have a PDAer. And I think for me, I had to shift from there's a really important shift from thinking my kids are capable of this. And so I'm going to continue to give them opportunities to do this, whether it's, you know, putting their shoes away, whether it's, picking up their orange peels from the floor by themselves, whether it's, cleaning up their messes, whatever it is that we like expect children to do as they get older and become more independent, bringing their backpacks in from the car, getting their own glass of water, whatever, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But like, I know that they're physically capable of doing it. I know that they have the skills, they have the awareness, and they can only access that when they're regulated. And I see that now after having accommodated for as long as I've been doing it, um, that there are lots of moments of regulation where they do take that on. And also there are lots of moments where even in regulation, I do those things for them just to be able to keep them in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And that is very different from where I came from, right? Like I think in even in gentle parenting, like the idea is for the child to be able to grow, but to be able to accept the emotions and feelings around the challenges that are growing up, right? But the pace is so different
Mm. Yeah.
with a child that has PDA that yes, you're doing that same thing, but you're still not setting those boundaries when your kid is 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20,
Yeah.
right?
And it really depends on how their cumulative nervous system stress or
Mhm.
activation is and how long you've been doing it,
Yes.
right? Like
Yeah.
it's only now for like 5 years into shifting things dramatically and then 4 years into PDA accommodations that there's that, as Dr. Alex Klein says, that just right challenge of introducing like, hey, I noticed you left your clothes all over the floor.
Right.
And it's fluctuating, right? Like on a day
Yes.
that's stressful, I'm not going to say that.
No.
But the 4 years in between, I was picking it up without saying anything, right?
Right. Right.
So, yeah. Is there anything that you still kind of get stuck on? Because we all do. Like, I
Yeah.
still have my moments, and I'm happy to share that as well. But if
Yeah.
there's anything coming to mind,
I think PDA parenting in public is still kind of like sticky for me sometimes, right? Because there is a fine line between like accommodating your children and also like being in a social situation where you are also accommodating other people. And I don't even mean in a people pleasing sense, although I think that does inform my discomfort with it.
yeah,
But like there's also like, I don't want another kid to feel bullied, even though I know it's not coming from a bullying space. Like I understand how certain behaviors are going to be perceived, right? And like
mhm,
certain things are or aren't appropriate for social situations, whether or not there's a reason behind it. And then there's, so I think there's like choosing which social situations I enter into, choosing people who understand what's going on and are able to allow me to accommodate my kids. And of course, I'm going to set a boundary to make sure that nobody else is ever hurt. And I'm not going to take one of my kids into a social situation when they're like in a dysregulated state. Like there's a lot that's informing whether or not I'm even in a social situation. But
yeah,
I'm also like, there are also things like, so we used to get together with some other families in the area, like every Saturday morning. It was like every Saturday morning, a bunch of people got together and it's like a multi-generational group, not just people our age. And, you know, before I understood PDA, like my kids would interrupt me. And, like my daughter, Rose in particular, she can't handle my nervous system going to anybody else. So, like, things will escalate very quickly if I take a phone call, if I am speaking to somebody else in front of her, it just immediately dysregulates. So then when I'm in a social situation where there's a bunch of other people talking to me, I haven't seen them in a week, we're catching up. It's like a
yeah,
normal social situation. Before, if she would interrupt, I would ask her to wait, right? Which
yeah,
is a socially appropriate thing to do. But I realized that, like, in order to accommodate her and in order for our home to be safe, like, it's not just like, well, in order to do this thing I think would be nice to do for her. It's like, no, in order for her to be safe, in order for our home to not be violent, in order for her to be able to walk by herself,
yeah,
I have to let her interrupt me.
yeah, yeah,
Otherwise, she's not going to be able to use her legs.
yeah,
So, and that isn't something that's easily explainable or that I want to explain or get into in a social situation. So, I started, we were still going to these Saturday morning gatherings and, someone would be talking to me and she would come and interrupt. And I'd have to say, excuse me to the adult and let my
yeah,
child talk to me. And then feel the energy of this other person being like, what the?
yeah,
Excuse me, but aren't you supposed to correct your child right now? They need to wait.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that kind of stuff is hard for me even still.
Of course. I mean, of
Yeah.
course. I think that for many parents, myself included, that's one of the hardest things, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like you learn the tools and strategies, you even might master them in your home, but then you move outside of that space and it's
Yeah.
like we all regress to like setting boundaries we wouldn't set or correcting or trying to teach just to
Yeah.
signal to the other that we're doing something actively to address or recognize that was, quote, inappropriate,
Right.
right? It's
Right.
like we have to signal that. But yeah, that's been a difficult part of my journey as well, with,
Yeah.
the tendency to people please and monitor for other people's comfort.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
It's not a good combo.
No, it's not.
Not a good combo.
No.
But we're all doing the work and the best
Yeah.
that we can, right?
Yeah.
Um, that's I love that story. Do you still do the Saturday mornings or have you adjusted your routine?
I've adjusted my routine. It's too hard for me a lot of the time now to do that because, I can't change anybody else's expectations of what my kids are able or not able to do and what like of how I need to parent. And I'm confident in what I'm doing, but I don't, I don't have the room to
Mm,
have the added stress of other people's expectations on me. So I've really I've really winnowed down my social calendar a lot,
mhm.
and part of it is just that parenting PDAers takes a lot of energy, right? Like when we are
Engagement.
lowering demands. That
Yeah,
way.
a lot of engagement, like
Yes.
constant social engagement.
Yes. Exactly. Which as an autistic individual myself is that can be enough for me, right? Just to do that with my kids. Like then I have you know, exhausted my capacity for engagement with others. So, or if I do the social engagement, then I don't have capacity for my kids. So that's, that and yeah, not wanting to feel the pressures, the eyes of others on me when parenting. Once in a while I'll go, but the kids will stay home. But
Mhm.
I've definitely rearranged how we do it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
those structural shifts that many
Yeah.
of us make. It's
Yeah.
painful,
It is. Yeah.
painful.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit,
Yeah.
um, into professional coaching, Kendall.
Okay.
Um, so one of the things that I've learned a lot from you actually in our work together is just some of the insights you're able to bring to gifted or 2E
Hmm.
PDA presentations, because I know all you're a gifted PDA autistic woman, you are raising gifted PDAers.
Yeah.
There's some patterns that are unique to that.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, why don't we just start with that and then we'll go to larger family dynamics. But, um, this is a learning space for me as well, the
Hmm.
2E space. So I'd love
Yeah.
to just hear, like, as you've raised your kids, as you've supported parents through your coaching and your work in the Paradigm Shift program, um, have you noticed any differences or patterns with 2E PDAers?
Yeah, I have. So one of the things that I notice with the two EPDAers and with the parents' experience of parenting a two EPDAer is a lot of times there's a lot more verbal equalizing happening. And so I think a lot of parents feel like my child can't be equalizing, like they're rational in this conversation. They're just putting me down. They're witty. They're,
Yeah,
like
you've laid out
like
a logical argument like a lawyer.
yeah, right, exactly. Exactly. It's like you're being cross-examined in your own home. And so it doesn't come off like a nervous system response because it doesn't look feral,
Yeah.
right? Um, and I think there's some reasons for that. Um, one is that so I think with gifted PDAers, one of the things that's unique is that when you are gifted, especially when you are younger, you have kind of a built-in equality accommodation, right? Like you can reason and think through things at the level of older children or at the level of some adults. And there's a lot of like talent that can come along with
Mhm.
having like understanding. And so you might be
Above everyone
above
naturally because
naturally,
you're
right?
like getting everything quick in class. You're good
Yep.
at a lot of things. You're catching the concepts quickly. It's not difficult for you
Yes.
to learn. Okay, this is super interesting.
Yeah. So I think that masks a lot of challenge and naturally accommodates a lot of the challenge that PDAers experience, right? So like, I mean, even from personal experience, like I was a very talented musician and like would win every competition. I would, I was like on television as like the principal flutist of the Disney orchestra when I was 12 and like, you know, performing singing for like celebrity fundraisers. Like there was a lot of like like a lot of um prestige that is really regulating to a PDAer because you are quote unquote above, right? And so I think a lot of that carries into the home, which is not like a situation where you're getting compared with other students, other, people in your field of choice, your activity of choice, right? But there's still like the the practice of being accommodated that way. And so I think like I noticed in my children, for instance, like Jamie loves to share facts about
Mhm.
things. And he's gifted, he's extremely bright, and he knows a lot about a lot of things, including things I don't know, right? But there's also like the fact that he's 7 and he doesn't know everything, but he might put together an explanation for something that sounds logical but isn't correct.
Yeah.
And he's telling this to me, but and I think it's easy to think like, oh, we're having a conversation. But what he's doing in that moment is not actually having a conversation. He is giving himself an equality accommodation, right? Where he's like, look at how much I know.
Yeah.
Look at that I know this thing, right? And so we parents might enter it into it as a conversation because it seems totally regulated. There, like we're not at a point where it even feels like being attacked verbally. It's just like, I'm sharing this fact. But if you're like asking questions about it and like forgetting to use declarative language, or you're like, you know, you might know an extra detail about it because maybe it's something that you're interested in as well. And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm finally getting to share with my child. But that's not really why the child came to you with that information. Then all of a sudden things start to escalate, right? And then you're not correct, or they're not accepting like the correction you've given about the fact or the extra information, et cetera. And it can really, really escalate quickly. And I think that can be really confusing for parents.
Yeah. You think you're engaging in a reciprocal conversation.
Yeah.
It's actually like in asking questions or inquiring or trying to get more context, it's actually activating that perception of like,
Yeah.
no, mom, don't try and like be above
Right.
me with this. This is my
Right.
thing.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because like when a gifted kid is in a classroom, like they're going to, a lot of times in a classroom, it's performative anyway. Like that's just how classrooms are structured. Do you know this or do you not? Right. Like,
Yeah.
can you talk about this or can you not? It's not a conversation in a classroom. And so then if a gifted PDA is trying to get that same like equality accommodation in the home, but it's a close relationship and the parent is interpreting it as a conversation, then it goes very differently, even though I think the intention from the child is the same.
Mm. It's so interesting. Like maybe in the classroom, it would be the teacher being like, yeah, that's exactly right. That's the right
Right.
answer. Instead
Yes.
of being like, oh, tell me more about that. Or,
Yeah.
I heard something about that. And then you giving your 2 cents. And it's like, no, we're
Hmm.
going on this train over here. Right? That's very
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. So you said the verbal equalizing, the fact
Yeah.
that, and I have never thought about this, but it makes total sense. Just the experience of a gifted child who might have giftedness in a talent or
Yeah.
intellectually or both,
Yep.
they're just from moving through the world gonna be, quote, above, their
Yes.
peers.
Yes.
And so it's preempting some of the natural neuroceptive moments when it's like you're below another child, right? There's just less of them.
Yes. Exactly. And
You're
I
the
think this is,
quickest, you're answering the questions.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is why too, obviously I don't have like data on this, but like, I think a lot of times, not always, but sometimes gifted kids will hit their burnout, not necessarily like in elementary school,
Hmm.
but like in high school or in college. All of a sudden you're at an Ivy League institution and there's not that built-in equality accommodation because there
Yeah.
are a lot of gifted kids around you.
Yeah, such a good insight. That's when I hit my burnout was I well, it was I started having panic attacks at 26 at an Ivy League institution in New
Yeah,
York City.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah,
Um, Not that I'm claiming I'm gifted, but just like it's just an interesting insight.
yeah,
One to noodle. One to noodle.
yeah. One to noodle, indeed.
um yeah, and then okay, so other things, and we talked a little bit about this, but
Yeah,
can we talk about perfectionism, like from your
yeah,
perspective?
yeah. So I feel like from my personal experience and watching my kids, and I've also had a number of clients with gifted children, one pattern that I see is, what can be interpreted as perfectionism. And I think that, and again, this is, like assimilating this information, but I have a theory that like for gifted individuals, there's an ability to like grasp a lot of information about something at once and to kind of process it as this whole entity with like all of the pieces in there. And so that kind of manifests in two different ways in terms of like how we see it dysregulating, I think. One is that we start with the whole picture and then figure out the pieces in there and how and why they fit and what can be removed. Like if you picture like a Jenga tower, like, okay, the whole thing is constructed, what pieces can be moved before the whole thing falls apart? Like what's integral and why? And so if somebody tries to move a piece, but you don't understand yet whether or not it's an integral piece of the picture,
Hmm.
then that can be very dysregulating and it's not like your choice. So that could be in a discussion with somebody, it can be in learning something, it can be in understanding something. Like personally, if I'm cooking a new recipe, like I have to cook it from the recipe and I cannot, I mean, I will get out the scale and weigh ingredients. Like it has to be exactly what it is. Not because I think it always needs to be that way, but until I understand why it was written that way, I'm not going to change anything about it. And
Hmm.
and so then I think like when others maybe they've already grasped this whole picture and like what can be moved and what can't start to act on that, but the person who's like the PDA hasn't quite put together that like figured out what's movable yet, then there's like a lot of uncertainty. It's like a loss of autonomy. It's, like I didn't choose to like interact with that part of the picture yet. And then there's also like, I think of like giftedness as like seeing things in technicolor. So like if you have this picture, it's extremely detailed and there are specific ways of seeing things, doing things, at least like if you have this perfectionistic tendency, and it's not necessarily that it's right or wrong, but it is what it is.
Like the
And so
first
then,
time you learned it, for example, or
yeah, yeah.
okay.
It's like in order, like when I learn something or when I see my kids learn something, they learn it as like, they learn every part of it together. And so then like, and it's like all fleshed out and all the details and you see it all. So if you're interacting with somebody on the same thing, so like let me try grounding this in an example. Like um let's say like I'm folding shirts. Like this is like a very simple thing, but like let's say I'm folding shirts and like I'm learning a way to do it where like I'm going to be able to see every shirt and it's going to be really easy to pick.
KonMariing. You're
Yeah,
doing
exactly.
KonMari folding. Okay, gotcha.
Exactly. Okay. So, I've like set up the drawers and I've like, I understand it's not just the doing, it's like why you're doing it, how to do it. Like,
The
there's a lot,
underlying philosophy of it.
yes, underlying literally like all of these nuanced aspects. And so if somebody isn't in agreement with that, like if my husband is like, I'm just gonna fold my shirts and put them in the drawer, right? It's like theoretically, I don't have a problem with him doing that, but it really like puts me on guard because I'm like, wait a second, like why wouldn't you do it this way? Right? Or like you know, putting even like I'm trying to think of like a good example, but it's like every little piece has a reason. There's a reason you're seeing the picture this way. And so then a parent comes in and, let's say you're making food together
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, you're going to season it a certain way, or you're going to, maybe you are following a recipe together. And like the parent sees like, a teaspoon of salt and maybe they put in a pinch, right? Or like, and it's close enough to a teaspoon and who knows if it would be exact, but like that wasn't part of the picture. And now I have to figure out like what is going to go wrong in this situation.
Yeah.
And there's like an incredulity that like, why would you do that? Because I'm seeing like I see this whole picture and it's all tied together, right? So like
Yeah.
if you're doing something differently, why are you doing that thing differently? And I haven't had the autonomy to process that I would also choose to do that thing differently.
Yeah. So there's two things going on. One, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, there's like a not understanding, like truly not understanding why someone would not do it the way that like your brain has captured is the way to do it with all
Yes.
of the detail and the underlying philosophy, like just to go with the KonMari example of
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
no, it's not just about folding the clothes. Like I've actually retained everything like Marie Kondo has said about folding, and there's a related philosophy to energy in the house, and like you've
Yeah.
retained everything about it
Mm-hmm.
because your brain can capture it.
Yeah.
So it's like both why wouldn't you do it according to this picture, which is
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, like why would you do it? Why would you do that?
Right.
And the loss of autonomy of the person breaking that picture
Yes.
without your consent. Is am I getting it right?
Yes.
Like you know
Yeah.
more about this than I do.
No, no, I think that's a really good summary of it. And I think that's where the PDA and the giftedness intersecting can create like
A loop.
a loop.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then you don't believe that it's a nervous system loop or a dysregulation loop because they're so articulate.
Yes.
You're like they're being manipulative or jerks or
Right.
yeah.
Controlling, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You
Overly
should be doing it this way.
perfectionist,
Right.
which has a underlying connotation of like you don't actually have to do it this way. Like you don't have to be that perfect. But
Right.
if the picture in the brain in the
There,
image is as such, like you do.
yeah. There are so many reasons underlying why you've decided to do something some way, right? Like exactly as you were saying, like you're retaining not only like this is the way to fold it, but the philosophy behind it. And like there's a lot of thought and a lot of nuance that goes into decisions, any kind of decision making, or that like you might think you can't achieve that much thinking in that short period of time about
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah. Like it's just folding.
It's just folding, but really there's so much around it, underneath it. And then to have to explain that too is really hard because you understand why, but it's not just like you understand why and the other person doesn't. It's like you understand why these things are intricately linked, and you don't understand why someone else wouldn't see that these things are intricately linked.
Mm, there it is. Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Very cool. Okay, so do you have any any thoughts on how we might adapt or apply some of the foundational approaches or accommodations that you and I work with parents on according to PDA as we're applying them to like a gifted PDA, for example?
Yeah. So I think I think communication accommodations are really huge for gifted PDAers because again, there's like, especially if somebody's like hyperlexic or hyperverbal, like there's an assumption that like they can have reciprocal conversation without it being dysregulating. They can have, like they're like, you don't have to use declarative language or you don't have to simplify language. Um, but I think especially because we assume that a lot of these interactions are just like quote unquote normal or regulated, but they're really like, you know, a child trying to be above their parent by introducing a topic of conversation, like to like reduce our own like amount of speech
Mm-hmm.
and um allow for more processing time, I think, even than a typical PDA, because again, there's like so much information that's like informing a child's response. And then assuming that there is nervous system threat when it doesn't appear that there is. Like, I think if you come to the spot where you identify that your gifted child is PDA,
Mm.
you should assume much more frequently that they have accumulated nervous system threat than you can see visibly.
See in the same way of like the feral animal or the growling or the
Right.
meltdown. Yeah, that
Right.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Um, I want to jump to your story a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so as you said, you are a PDA, gifted PDA autistic woman, and I was wondering, how did you figure that out? And what was
Yeah.
that realization like for you?
Yeah. So, I started figuring it out. I started figuring out that I was autistic maybe when, again, researching these like female presentations of autism, atypical presentations of autism, um,
For Jamie.
for Jamie.
Okay.
Yeah. So this has now been like a couple years ago. And I just kept thinking like that sounds a lot like me. Um and just like historically, I've always been somebody who's like kind of counterculture, like, and I never kind of like fit the stereotypes that I was supposed to fit, right? Like I just always was a little bit out, and um I never liked being part of a group. It was too much pressure to be a certain way. I needed to have my autonomy and like decide whether I wanted to join or not. And and so a lot of these concepts, like once I got to the root cause of PDA being, a threat to autonomy and equality, I was like, well, I feel that. Like
Yeah.
that just kind of clicked. Like that just makes sense to me,
Like feel
uh,
it in your body? Like, do you?
yeah.
Okay, let's hear a little bit more.
Yeah. So like okay, so when I was in college, for instance, like I remember sitting in classrooms and like we'd be having like a discussion about something and someone would make a point and there was like literal vibration in my body. My mouth would start to get dry.
Mm.
And I just was like, I need to prove this person wrong. Like, that was like the thought in my head, right? Like whether or not I knew where they were going from the beginning, I just like, I need to provide the counterpoint. And it was like a
Even if
physiological,
even if you agreed with like even if you would have just I'm just curious, even if you
yeah,
would have agreed with them in another context where they were like having a conversation with another person and you overheard, like you might think, "Oh, I agree with that."
yeah, yeah, I think so. So it's like, it wasn't, it's kind of like being on a debate team or something. Like, you can always argue both sides, and I needed to always argue the other
The other
side. Yeah. And it was a physiological response attached to needing to argue the other side. And I would just like, my face would flush, like I'd be like totally red across my cheeks. And then, and I would do it politely, right? But like that was a need that I had in college even. And like, as a kid, like one of the famous stories in my family is like, I was what I now realize is like selectively mute in my first preschool that I attended. And I think I must have been there for like 6 months, and they had no idea that I could talk. I was 3. Um, and like this is at the same time that at home I'm like a chatterbox. I've taught myself to read already, and they didn't know
Wow.
that I could speak. I was just nothing.
Like they'd never heard you speak.
They'd never ever heard me utter a word.
Wow.
And then and then my mom was like pregnant at the time with my younger sister, and they were being very sweet, and they were like, Kendall, we heard that your mommy has a baby in her tummy. And the very first thing I said ever, like the first thing I was ever compelled to say was, no, she has a baby in her uterus. But it was like, it was like this need to correct the adult,
Yeah.
right? Like nothing else had really mattered. And I, was having a nervous system reaction where I wasn't able to speak, but this like put me into fight, right?
Yeah, put you into equalizing.
Into equalizing. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So that
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so you notice these in the moment responses in your body.
Yeah.
Um, and at the time, did you understand them, or was it like, why is my body doing this?
I did not understand. No, I really didn't know. And I didn't know that it was necessarily abnormal either. I just knew that I felt that way, or I felt strongly about things, right? But then when I was like learning about like PDA burnout, and I
Mm,
was like, oh, I've had that. Like I've been through that. I've lost access to basic needs like multiple times in my life.
yeah,
I have, it took me 8 years to get my undergraduate degree. I didn't apply to college because I didn't like, I just didn't, and I dropped out of all my AP classes as a senior in high school. There were lots of times where I like left an educational system because I couldn't handle it. I was in a burnout, right?
yeah,
But I didn't realize what was happening at the time. But it happened a lot, you know? And so kind of looking at that and being like, well, does this lens fit if I look at these periods of my life through a PDA lens? And, and it did fit. You know, I've always been somebody who can be very social, and I am interested in people, but also it's exhausting for me, but I am very high masking. And even as a child, like, I would go and like be social, and like, I'm from LA. I would like adopt the Valley Girl accent and just like be one of the group. And then I would come home and be like comatose. Like I
yeah,
was like on my bed, or, sleeping, or just I couldn't like engage with anybody for like the rest of the day. Um, but like in these periods of burnout, like totally lost any like performative social ability whatsoever. It just became like very awkward, like
yeah,
like I would go to a store with my sister, and like I remember once we like went to a store and I was buying shorts or something, and like I blocked out. It was so embarrassing. I don't even remember what exactly happened, but I remember like it was a super embarrassing encounter with like the person at the register. Just like I couldn't do the small talk. I couldn't do these like high masking things for social interaction. And my sister, like when we walked out of there, she was like, her eyes were wide. She was like, Kendahl, what happened? Like that was like so awkward, and that would happen in these moments. Oh God, I remember super embarrassing thing that happened when I was this is when I was working. I was in San Francisco. I'd graduated college and I was looking back very much in burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And I had just switched jobs. And the job that I was starting, I was leaving a job in philanthropy and going to a job in like as a project manager at like a medical translation company. And I'd had this one woman there who was about my age at the time, we were in our 20s, but she had done my interview and like I walked in and it was my first day on the job and I like went and gave her a hug and it was just like I remember thinking like that's not what you do when you're not close with someone, right? Like at this like very corporate office, like it was so socially inappropriate and I just remember being like why did I do that? Like but not having access to that like social grace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like the having to compute it rather than just knowing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Um, so you and I have talked, I hope you're okay with me bringing up this story, but going back to
Yeah.
how you're a musician, I remember you
Yeah.
saying once in a conversation that you lost your ability to play the flute.
Yeah. And I lost my ability to sing. So flute was my first instrument, but voice was like my main instrument by the time I got to college. And when I was at Amherst, I went through like a major burnout and I completely lost the ability to do anything creative. I couldn't sing anymore. I couldn't, I literally spent 6 months, a year, not being able to sing. And I ended up majoring in music and I couldn't do it. Like I just couldn't do it. I ended up taking time off from school. But yeah, it was like a physical inability to access my vocal cords in the same way. Like I couldn't produce sound in the same way that I normally did. I couldn't emote with my face in the same way that I normally could. I couldn't, like, I just didn't have access to those muscles in the same way.
Yeah, which
Yeah,
totally makes sense through the understanding of the nervous system because we need, like, the vagus nerve innervates our face. And so, like, when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, or even shut down, we like can't smile or crinkle our eyes or any of it because we're like not getting that safe and social part of the nerve working.
totally.
So last night I was on one of the live calls for this polyvagal certificate course, and it was with Dr. Stephen Porges, and someone
Yeah.
asked a question about masking, which was so
Okay.
interesting. And he gave an example of an opera singer that he had worked with who had lost her voice, and it was because she had stopped having access to her social engagement system because she was in the performance masking and viewing her audience as like she was appeasing the audience as a nervous system response rather than the audience being like a co-regulator, right?
Yes.
A back and forth or a
Yes.
safe nervous system in the audience.
Hmm.
And she could do that for a long time, but it had a cost to where she hit her threshold and could no longer sing.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, and it was totally related to the vagus nerve and how it is, part of our throat and our face.
Hmm.
And the example just made me think of your story.
Yeah.
Because at the time you probably were like, why is this happening?
Yeah. I had no idea. I mean, it was like, I had been performing like my entire life, my entire life.
Yeah,
And
with
that
the with
was
the
like,
celebrities and the Disney audience. I mean, that's like no joke right there.
yeah, no, it was like foundational for me. And then all of a sudden, like I remember a professor asking if I could perform as part of this, like some kind of like multicultural music performance thing that was happening. And I was like, I can't. I just couldn't even sing. I couldn't remember things. I was like not confident in my ability to even remember lyrics, but I literally couldn't access my voice.
Yeah.
You know? My voice sounded different. Even when I was talking, it sounded different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because,
Yeah.
as Dr. Porges said last night, we're broadcasting like in our voice, on our face,
Yeah.
what our heart and nervous system is doing, like physiologically. And
Right.
that's actually what led to the question about masking. Like, can you hide the broadcast,
Right.
whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent? And the woman brought up the question of masking, and it was such a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
well, why don't we wrap up here? This was such a good conversation. We'll
Yeah.
have to save the larger family dynamics topic for our next session together, next live
Perfect.
session. But I mean, I know I learned a lot just from this conversation about recognizing in the families that we work with both when there might be 2E, which I should define as twice exceptional, where a child might have giftedness and a disability, like
Mhm.
PDA, but also the sticking points for parents, as you said, where the assumption is going to be harder to potentially, the assumption that the behavior is under their conscious control of the child or teen, it's a harder assumption to move through because of the type of equalizing. So that was
Yeah.
a great insight. So thank you so much, Kendall.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was super fun.
We will see each other again soon.
Sounds good.